Gentlemen, we will begin our session Why We Write shortly. I request all of you to please take your seats. Kindly turn off your cell phones or switch them to silent. And it would be greatly appreciated if you maintain silence throughout the session. We will have a question and answer session at the end of the discussion. You are requested to please keep your questions short and refrain from making comments so we can accommodate maximum number of questions. Our panelists for today are Sorayya Khan, Paul Harding, and Shandana Minhas. I will take this opportunity to introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Framji Minwalla. He is currently the chair of the Department of Social Sciences and Liberal Arts at the Institute of Business Administration in Karachi. He has taught at numerous institutions, including Yale University, Vassar College, Dartmouth College, the George Washington University, New York University, Fordham University, and Zabist. Dr. Minwalla was awarded a BA by the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and an MFA and a DFA, both by the Yale School of Drama. Before we start the session, we're going to maintain a moment of silence. We're going to observe a moment of silence, as we have been doing since this morning, for Sabine Mahmood, director, T2F, and human rights activist. After which I request Framji Minwalla to please continue with the session. Thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Well, good evening already. We've been holding moments of silence all day in memory of Sabine. And there's plenty of information online about Sabine, about the work that she did. Some of you, I think, attended the panel session that was done at around 3:45. Please, I urge you to find out more about her and her work. She was just an extraordinary human being. And did extraordinary work and really deserves to be more widely known. If you don't know about her work, please go and look her up. The panel today is Why We Write. And I have three exceptionally wonderful authors on this panel. Unfortunately, the fourth author, Mohammad Hanif, went back to Karachi this morning, so he will not be joining us. I'll quickly read their bios. Paul Harding is an American musician and author, all the way on the right over there, on my right, and author of the novel Enon. His first novel, Tinkers, won the 2010 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. He is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and the Penn Bingham Fellowship for Writers, among other honors. His work has been translated into more than 20 languages. He has taught at Harvard University, Grinnell College, and the University of Iowa, where he is currently a visiting professor at the Writers' Workshop. To my left is Shandana Minhas, is a Pakistani English language novelist. Her first novel, Tunnel Vision, was shortlisted for the Commonwealth Writers' Prize in 2008. Her second book, Survival Tips for Lunatics, won the KLF French Embassy Fiction Prize for 2015. Her fiction has appeared in the Indian Quarterly and been adapted for stage and screen. Her columns and essays have appeared in assorted op-ed pages and online. She was a writer-in-residence at the University of Iowa's International Writing Program in 2013. Shandana is currently working on another novel and a short story collection. And on my immediate right, Sorayya Khan is an English-language Pakistani novelist who has so far published 3 novels, City of Spies this year, 5 Queens Road in 2009, and Noor in 2003. She is the recipient of a Fulbright Research Award, the Malahat Review Novella Prize, and a constant Saltonstall Artist Grant that took her to post-tsunami Banda Aceh. She presently lives in New York. Welcome, everybody, welcome. The idea for this panel was really came to me and to the organizers of the festival this year in relation to George Orwell's very famous essay, Why I Write, and also Manto's short essay, How I Write Stories. And I'd like to read short quotes from both these and then turn it over to my illustrious panelists, who I hope will then take over and illuminate you about their processes of writing, what compels them to write, etc. So this is what Manto writes. What can I tell you about how I write stories? It is a very convoluted matter. With this how before me, I could say I sit on the sofa in my room, take out paper and pen, utter Bismillah, and start writing. While all three of my daughters keep making a lot of noise around me, I talk to them as I write, settle their quarrels, make salad for myself, and if someone drops by for a visit, I show him hospitality. During all this, I don't stop writing my story. If I must answer how I write, I would say my manner of writing is no different from my manner of eating, taking a bath, smoking cigarettes, or wasting time. I write because I'm addicted to writing, just as I'm addicted to wine, for if I don't write a story, I feel as if I'm not wearing any clothes, I haven't bathed, or I haven't had my wine. The fact is, I don't write stories, stories write me. Orwell, on the other hand, is somewhat more clinical and classificatory in his approach. He says, putting aside the need to earn a living, I think there are four great motives for writing, at any rate for writing prose. They exist in different degrees in every writer, and in any one writer the proportions will vary from time to time according to the atmosphere in which he is living. They are, 1, sheer egoism, desire to seem clever, to be talked about, to be remembered after death, to get your own back on the grown-ups who snubbed you in childhood, etc., etc. It is humbug to pretend this is not a motive, and a strong one. Writers share this characteristic with scientists, artists, politicians, etc., in short, with the whole top crust of humanity. The great mass of human beings are not acutely selfish. At the age of about 30, they almost abandon the sense of being individuals at all and live chiefly for others, or are simply smothered under drudgery. But there is also the minority of gifted, willful people who are determined to live their own lives to the end, and writers belong in this class. 2, aesthetic enthusiasm, perception of beauty in the external world, or on the other hand, in words and their tight right arrangement, pleasure in the impact of one sound on another, in the firmness of good prose, or the rhythm of a good story, desire to share an experience which one feels is valuable and ought not to be missed. 3, historical impulse, desire to see things as they are, to find out true facts and store them up for the use of posterity. Or 4, political purpose, using the word political in the widest possible sense, desire to push the world in a certain direction, to alter other people's idea of the kind of society that they should strive after. Once again, no book is genuinely free from political bias. The opinion that art should have nothing to do with politics is itself a political attitude. So, without much ado, I'd like to turn first to Sorayya and ask her specifically, what compels you to write? Do you think Orwell's classifications are useful, or do you rather sit on Manto's side of the line?
Well, this question of why I write is such I was just mentioning that the question, why I write, is so neat and so concise. I wish I had a neat and concise response that was equally eloquent. So the way I think about why I write, I feel like I'm a combination of both of them in some sense, and then a little bit of my own. So Mantu talks about being addicted to writing. I feel very much a compulsion to write, but I think about addiction as, you're getting something at some point that's very joyful from it as well. And I find that my need to write is not always full of joy. It's also a struggle sometimes. So I don't know if anybody else feels that way.
I was just trying to think of the writer who was it, says, I don't like writing, I like having written.
Oh, who said that?
I don't know who it was, but I think sometimes it can be painful, but I have the same, I don't have when I was brought up as a writer, I was taught by a lot of writers who insisted that you had to get up every day and face the blank page, no matter what, whether you had anything to write or not. And I thought, I'd rather watch a baseball game. I have children to raise. So I can go for weeks on end where to all appearances I'm napping on the couch, and my wife will say, "What are you doing?" And I'll say, "I'm writing." And in my case, it's sort of the pot has to simmer and bubble sometimes for weeks and months. And then I get kind of so internally and externally aggravated that there's a certain threshold I cross where nothing will do but writing fiction in my case,
Somebody asked me this question a couple of years ago, and I said I write because I'm the wrong gender to play competitive sports. These days I'm leaning towards, I don't know who said it, but I write because it's the most fun you can have with your clothes on.
That's it? You don't want to add to that? No. Okay. Can you talk a little bit about whether egoism comes into it, or perhaps political motives?
I write in order to try to get rid of ego, or I sort of try to be selfless. I mean, my motive for writing is largely to sort of we work with fictional characters, but it's to sort of listen to other human lives articulate themselves, and for me not to interpose and interpose myself or exert my will on them or twist their arms to sort of utter pieties or witticisms that I'd like people to really think, oh, that Paul Harding, he's so smart. I don't want people to hear me in my own writing. One of the things about politics is, when I started trying to write, I did have a motive for trying to be, I wanted people to think that I had progressive politics, and I wanted people to know how enlightened I was and all this sort of stuff. But every time I actually ended up writing overtly political fiction, it was just trash. It was propaganda. It was nothing anybody should ever have to suffer through. So then I just started writing what I thought of was, this kind of metaphysical, lyrical stuff, and I just figured that I had written myself out of any kind of political or social sphere. But then it just turned out that I just think of my writing as it stands in contradiction to what I don't like about politics and bad politics, bad.
I have egoism in writing. Paul said something remarkably wise in our conversation earlier about how when he's writing, if it sounds like his own voice, he'll keep going until his own voice is gone. So that often, you do, when you're writing a novel or fiction, or even if it's in a shorter form, you aspire for that, right? The loss of yourself, you're actually writing to get rid of ego. But it depends on form. For example, a lot of us also write columns or essays where you actually have to come from your own place. And then it's remarkable how often to write something and realize what a large ego you have.
And is it useful, the large ego?
No, I think this is the wonderful thing. Writing is one of those things that you get better at as you age. And you're more self-aware, and you learn a lot about yourself, and ego becomes much easier to handle.
Okay. So, yeah.
In some senses, ego is... every time you have to press it. In some senses, ego is essential because writing is hard and there's a lot of rejection out there. So you better have some ego to face that. I mean, rejection fortifies that a little bit. But in terms of politics, I guess I have a little bit of a different perspective. I feel like in my writing, I'm interested in exploring the world. And I'm interested in how the world exists in people. And so for me, I think of writing both as being exploring the world and figuring out how the world comes together in people's relationships and who they are. So in some ways, politics, history, political events, whatever we want to call it, is always somehow part of the backdrop, if not the main story. So.
In Noor, you write about 1971 and Bangladesh. In City of Spies, you've written about the coup and the Bhutto government, and then Zia's coup. Both of those are remarkably political specifically political subjects. Do you feel compelled to actually report when you're writing, or to reimagine the events when you're writing, or to restructure them in some ways?
Well, what I'm most interested in is talking about humanity in a political context. So that my path towards writing took me to graduate school, and what I really wanted to do, or what I thought I wanted to do, was to study international relations and international studies. And then once I did that, I got a sense that it was very interesting to me and very illuminating how I could see how the world system came together, the family of nation states and all that. But in that visual picture, what was missing was people. Like, you read news reports, but you don't know anything about the people who are being killed, or how the events are affecting characters' lives. And so that's when really I moved away. At some level, there was some frustration involved, and I moved away towards trying to examine a sliver of humanity in a political context.
Okay. Paul?
Yeah. Like I said, every time I tried to write something overtly political, it just turned to propaganda. I just couldn't figure out a way to get the. I'm interested in character, so it was hard for me to sort of write. I mean, to me, it was always ended up being sort of writing from ideas or themes, trying to write from them into characters, which I couldn't do because I just has to do with my inability in that case to get real human beings out when I start with ideas or concepts. So I always just start with individuals, and hopefully by trying to make them into creations that resemble real human beings, they then by virtue just naturally end up having their own politics, their own history. The characters I write about tend to be rather impoverished, and when you place them in the context of the history of the United States, where they are, and historically, it's just implicit, where they would lie in the history and the political spectrum.
I mean, what is interesting, I think, in three of your novels, Tunnel Vision and Shandana's, Tinkers, yours, Paul's, and Noor especially, is they are all three narratives about recovering a past that has been either repressed or lost. And that you both, actually, all three of you, use very different aesthetic strategies to get to that. So if anybody doesn't know, the central character, can we call her the central character in Noor? Noor.
We could, yeah.
Is a child who actually communicates by making art, and making art that reflects the repressed experiences of her parents, of her family, from the Bangladesh war. And in fact, she unlocks for her family the memories that they have themselves locked away for years. Yes, would that
Correct.
be fair?
That's
in Tinkers, your protagonist, who is lying on a hospital bed, dying, remembers or tries to remember the past of his grandfather. Is it the grandfather in the 19th century New England, and the life of an impoverished tinker going from door to door to selling merchandise.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Clockmaker.
Yep.
Yes. And in Shandana's, a woman, Aisha, lying in a coma, who remembers her life while she is actually in her coma, and in fact remembers an absent figure in her life, an absent father, right? Who becomes in some ways the linchpin of the memory that isn't there. So can you talk a little bit about what it is that compels you to dig into the past, think about memory in relation to fiction, in relation to imagination?
I don't know if it's about the past. So the protagonist of Tunnel Vision, Aisha, is in a coma, and I realized afterwards. I'm one of those people who don't realize until afterwards, acha, That's what happened. She's in a coma, and the coma was a metaphor for life as a woman in Pakistan. I mean, I wrote it in 2007. So she has a car accident, and she has to decide. She's floating above her body. She's watching everything that happens to her as she moves between Civil and Jinnah and Aga Khan. And she has to decide whether she wants to come back. So that the central metaphor was coma as what our lives are like as Karachi women. My second book, Survival Tips for Lunatics, is essentially probably a dream that the kid is having. A story I wrote in between, Toba Take Who, which is a take on a mantra story actually, is about a woman who is constantly hallucinating and doesn't know that she's hallucinating. So I guess I have been compelled to examine dislocation and absence, and there's that thing that you write to explain yourself to yourself. So maybe that's just my engagement with.
I think that on the topic of memory, when I think about my work, I'm very interested in memory. I'm very interested and in some ways I feel like my novels are in conversation with memory. In some interviews that I've conducted for my research, for my various novels, I'm always so amazed how people experiencing similar events can have completely different memories of what actually might have happened. And I'm interested in trying to reconcile that, because this is how we all go through our lives, right? And so I think memory is critical to the way I think about my writing.
I guess in Tinkers I was interested in, I have the sort of the deathbed scene, the family vigil, the patriarch is dying, the whole family assembles around him. And I guess I was just interested in a way it was, in fact, we brought my grandfather home during his final illness, and I was put in the strange position of being the oldest grandchild in the family. So my grandmother said, "You're in charge. You're going to orchestrate your grandfather's death when you're going to orchestrate the family being." And so it was the last time I spent with him, as he was so formative in my life. And the time that I spent with him during his last week and a half of illness was watching the person I had known dissipate. He just that self corroded, but as it did, it leaked out into his memories of his father and other people in his family, and he would actually almost take on the voices. He would start talking as his father almost. And so then when I went back to fictionally examine that, it lent itself to the idea of assembling a self out of a self that was in the process of dissolving. So it could, so it sort of advanced and retreated and contracted back into itself, and then would disperse back over generations of the family in different geographical and generational locations.
Could we talk a little bit about the influences in your work? People have called your work, Paul, Faulknerian.
Thank you.
You yourself refer to the 19th century American transcendentalists like Thoreau and Emerson, Hawthorne. Can you talk a little bit about who, as writers, have influenced you and how they have influenced you?
Yeah, absolutely. I read as widely and as deeply as I can, but the readers to whom I keep coming just by natural disposition, but I also think it feels like geographical location and historical, it becomes all part of the landscape, are the New England transcendentalists, who I think of as all my great aunts and uncles. I think of, Uncle Emerson and Aunt Emily Dickinson and all these people. And, I don't know, but here, in the United States, there's this thing, called like the anxiety of influence, which I just reject. To me, it's the privilege of influence. It's the luxury of influence. It's the deep pleasure of writing in a tradition, implicating yourself within a tradition with which you want to be associated. So as long as your writing is not merely imitative or derivative, there's just a great pleasure in taking up my favorite writers and thinking about their, what they were preoccupied with, which are the, why are we here, who are we, where did we come from, where are we going, and just pushing pushing that tradition along. And even though Faulkner was from Mississippi, I still consider him a New England transcendentalist. I just get to, just randomly. And partly also because of the way that all of those writers put the greatest amount of aesthetic and metaphysical pressure on the English language to explore meaning kind of at the outer margins of where meaning can be meaningfully precipitated into language.
Sorayya?
In terms of that question, I don't know whether I can so readily come up with writers that have influenced me. I read widely and I read a lot, and I'm very interested in writers and the language that they use and the structures, the solutions that they come up with in terms of their narratives. But when I think about influences, I think that I feel like my life was changed by reading some books, for sure. And one of those books I read many years ago was Marquez's The Autumn of the Patriarch. I thought, my God, one can write stories about the madness that is our world, and they can ring true. I thought that was really remarkable. So, there are books here and there, but in terms of lineage and in terms of thinking of where I might fit in and books that I keep going back to, I'm not sure that I can come up with anything quite as eloquent in terms of situating myself.
When you say solutions to narratives, could you expand on that? Narrative issues, questions?
Well, one of the things that I struggle with in my writing is structure. I'm always trying to figure out how best to tell a story, and I'm always trying to figure out from draft to draft to draft how to better do it. And so when I read a novel, I'm always curious about how the author has figured out to provide backstory, or to, how the author makes decisions. So another book, which is a really very small book that transformed the way I thought about narrative, I came across just by accident, was a book by Harriet Dorr, a North American writer who wrote her first book, I think she was 70, I'm not sure, maybe even older than that, called Stones for Ibarra. It's this thin little book written in the cleanest, simplest language, and one knows from the very first page what the whole book is about. You know the ending, but still, as a reader, you're turning page after page after page. There's so much narrative drive there. So that changed the way I thought about narrative. One could write so simply, so cleanly, and get the point across.
Thank you. Shandana?
I would agree with Sorayya, actually. I'm also, I never know how to answer that question, and I find it very hard to locate myself in a tradition or in a, I haven't really thought about it. I think, one, I know that I am very easily influenced. I would read anything, and I would start thinking like that. You pick up on a rhythm, etc., etc. If I would have to define the influence that governed my writing life, I would say it was the hours that I spent as a child. My mother used to teach literature and language. And when I was very little, and she was very overworked, she had 3 children and a job, and she did all the housework. So when she was overworked, she would let me help her with her corrections. Probably not, okay, but I remember, and this is when you had foolscap sheets and ink pens, and I remember the feel of the paper. I remember the presence of books. So I would say that's my influence. Not the books themselves, but the aura of the written word.
And in terms of where you write, is there, or in the environments in which you write, what kinds of environments are most conducive? What kinds of environments sort of inspire you, propel you, compel you? Quiet, noise?
Okay. I was just going to say that I think initially when I began writing, I used to feel like I had to have my cup of tea, and I had to have silence, and I had to have a clean desk, and then children cured me of all that. And I learned how to write no matter what the noise level was, writing in the car, waiting for them, picking them up after soccer games, and really becoming very disciplined in short snatches of time. So in terms of I can write anywhere. I need the discipline. I do better if I have the discipline of writing every day. That helps me. It helps me keep my train of thought. I require that more as I get older. But yeah.
You said something earlier.
Yeah, I would just second. Before I had children, I was much more coy about writing. I'd say the muse didn't show up today. I'm not going to, And then I had children. It's like the muse better show up because you got work to do, buddy. And I do that. I remember my first son had chronic ear infections, and so we'd have these long nights where nobody would get any sleep, and the only way we could get him to sleep is I'd have to drive him around our town, and he'd fall asleep in the back, in the car seat, and the minute he fell asleep, I'd pull over in the nearest spot I could find and write tinkers. And so I have all these little notebooks that say, Sam sick in back of the car, October 3rd, and then and I think it's the same sort of thing. I had this idea in my mind of, I've got my study with the wood-paneled, bookshelves that look out onto the picture. And there's actually a room kind of like that in my house, and I don't think I've written a single word in it. It's all sort of, I'm cooking dinner and working on a sentence and getting the kids here and there and all that,
Yeah, absolutely, and I'm so relieved to hear, for a change, writers talking about their children and what they've added to their writing process, as opposed to complaining, "Oh, I was such a great writer," and you wearing certain kinds of shoes. I also have those notebooks. They have Hangman in the front and Pokemon drawings in the back, and if I'm lucky, I'll get 2 pages out of it. Yeah, I can write anywhere.
So I'd like to. If you'll indulge me for a second. So there's a second quote in this Munto essay that I'd like to read. So Munto says, "Stories don't reside in my mind, they reside in my pocket, totally unbeknownst to me. Try as hard as I might to strain my mind, hoping for some story to pop out, trying equally hard to be a short story writer, smoke cigarette after cigarette, but my mind fails to produce a story. Often when my wife finds me feeling totally defeated and out of my wits, she says, don't think, just pick up your pen and start writing. So advised by her, I pick up my pen and start writing, with my mind totally blank, but my pocket crammed full of stories. All of a sudden a story pops out on its own. This being the case, I'm forced to think of myself as not so much a writer of stories, but more as a pickpocket who picks his own pocket and then hands over its contents to you." Can you talk a little bit about that? Do stories come to you in sort of flashes, in spurts? Do you have to work at ideas?
I find that I get stories from all sorts of different sort of sources, and so I just take them where I get them. I think as writers, it's always, particularly when you're writing about writing, it's tempting to come up with kind of picturesque ways of how, but for me, ideas are so few and far between. I'll just take them where I get them. So sometimes I just get like a single line that, just like a sentence pops into my mind, and I just start, I write the next sentence, or the sentence previous to it or whatever, and just start building from there. Or I get a visual image, almost like, for some reason, I don't write much, my books are not plotted, and for some reason fiction comes to me very often almost as pictures, as photographs, so it's like an arrested moment. And so what I do with them narratively is it's an instant in time that I, in English, it's called, in mechanical drawing, it's called an exploded view, which is, if you buy like a washing machine or a lawnmower or something like that, there's a picture of it with all the pieces. It looks like it's been, and so that's what I feel like I do narratively with instants of time. I just explode instants and just parse them out and just interrogate them and try to find out what the heck it is that I'm looking at.
Shandana?
Yeah, sometimes there's a visual image. I was just thinking of another Pakistani writer once asked me, listen, I don't have any ideas. Do you have any ideas you don't need? So yeah, sometimes it's a visual image. John Irving, who I love, who also is a product of the IO Writers Workshop, doesn't start a novel until he knows the last sentence.
He knows the last sentence.
So when we were thinking of influence earlier, and sometimes you're in between books or in between stories, and you're thinking, what should I do? What should I do? That's when influence comes in, because then you start thinking, wait, so and so does it like this. So I actually spent a week once trying to think of a last sentence. I had no idea what the story was, and then eventually I calmed down. I think stories just come to you; they pick you. It's not the other way around. For me.
Could you say again, for people who were not here for our panel on Friday, about Survival Tips for Lunatics, how you wrote that over that summer? Which will bring all these things together, perhaps.
Yeah, I basically said that for parents, summer vacation is actually the worst time of the year. For children, it's the best time of the year. And I had the 2 boys at home. There wasn't a lot to do. And anyway, these days, what are you going to do? Send them out to cycle? So I had to entertain them, and a lot of things had been happening. And so I wrote, and I'd write a chapter a day, and I'd read it to them, and they'd give me their input. And yeah, it just happened.
Yeah, so Survival Tips for Lunatics is actually a children's novel about 2 boys who are abandoned in Hingle National Park and have to find their way back to Karachi without their parents.
Yeah, it's a comedy about Balochistan.
Yeah, it is a comedy about Balochistan. It's a stunning little novel. You should read it. Sorayya?
Well, I would like that problem of having a pocket crammed full of stories and then them just popping up. I feel like that the stories that I have pursued in my novels have been with me for a long time. That I've almost been obsessed with them for many years, and they've grown inside me, and I haven't been looking for more stories because those stories have been there. And and when one story gets done, I already had the other one in the back of my mind. I hadn't started to work on it yet, but it was very much there. And so really my novels have developed always knowing what the next one is going to be. If I had to come up with ideas right now, I would not be able to do that. But the thing I found very interesting with what Paul said was that I find that my writing and the details and what I think of really as fragments around which my novels are written, the fragments become blocks, which then become scenes, which then become chapters, et cetera, do come to me also very visually. So I can just imagine a scene, or I can see a scene, and then in that scene, the story lies, and I have to figure out what that story is inside those colors, inside that texture, with those smells. So in that way, I thought really resonated what Paul had to say about that.
One final question, and then I think we'll open it up for questions from the audience. When do you know you're done?
I don't think you're ever done. I don't think that one is ever satisfied. Or,
okay.
I mean, sometimes you're tired and you give up. But do you guys feel differently?
My experience with my 2 books is, I write in such a slapdash, haphazard way. I have no plan ahead of time. It's just like I'm walking around with a dowsing rod, and I just sort of, actually one of the metaphors I use is, they have these little robot vacuum cleaners that they say just kind of bounce around the room, and the engineers promise you that if you just let them go, they'll eventually vacuum clean the whole room. That's how I write. I just sort of, and I very intuitively bounce against the outer edges of the novel and then go back in. And in both cases, I write and I write and I write, and then in both cases, there's been one day where I've finished a day's writing and just realized, oh, that's it, I've written everything. And then the rest of it's just a matter of actually going back and taking the mess of the manuscript and putting it in order, which in the case of Tinkers, I actually printed up the whole thing, cut it up into all of its little sections that I had written in fragments out of it, and laid it all out on my living room floor and spent the weekend putting it in order. For better or for worse, you be the judge.
So I think that I get done with my novels when I really can't bear to look at them anymore. I have to have that feeling to be able to let it go, and not being able to look at it, or not being able to contemplate another draft is a way of getting to that point. And then there's some way, though, there's some intuition about feeling like not necessarily that you've made it right, but that you've done what you can to it. It's going to be as right as it can be for the moment. But I agree, you can go back and read a chapter and think, oh, why did I use that word? I just had that experience the other day. So.
There is actually a very famous misattributed quote that says, "Art is never finished, only abandoned." And I actually went online to find the attribution for it, and discovered that it was misattributed to many different people, including Leonardo da Vinci and Paul Valéry and Pablo Picasso. But my favorite part about this website that I found was the comment at the end of it, which said from some individual named Noshaba, says, with many, many O's and many, many E's, poo-facey. Leonardo da Vinci was an ugly, stupid poo-face who knew nothing. So with that, we can open it up to the floor for questions.
Okay, sorry.
It's working.
Hello. Okay, thank you. Thank you all for all your great conversations. I was reading up on an interview of Murakami, and he recalls that he can tell the exact moment when he decided that he'll be able to write a novel. He was watching a baseball game in his local town, and one of the batters hit the ball, and that was the exact moment when he decided that, well, I'll leave my bar and my business and I'll write a novel. Well, for someone like me, it was really astounding, because for Murakami to say such a glamorous thing is okay, because he's accomplished, he's written some of the greatest novels in the modern era, and for all of you to actually say all these fancy things is amazing. You have your pictures, and you have your children, and you have your kids and everything. But I want to hear something real, that what is it that makes you write? Is it that you've learned to write good language? Is it that you guys have fears, you have insecurities, you have angst, you have happiness? I mean, why don't I write? And why do you people write?
What happened to you when you read that quote was actually a visual image, because Murakami wrote a book called What We Talk About When We Talk About Running, or What I Talk About, right? He built up to that moment over a very long time. And that's what he was condensing into that throwaway line. Because, yeah, we can't resist a good line, but there is more than a visual image into it. As for why don't you write? I don't know. That's a question you should answer.
Afternoon was about the aim of you people, why you write, what you achieve, what you think you will achieve by writing. But one thing which is, I think, missing in this discussion was, what was the factor which created the urge to write? In fact, let me tell you, pardon me, I think this particular thing I have to talk in Urdu. एक बहुत मशहूर शायर है हमारे मीर, उनका एक शेर है कि मीर मुझको शायर न कहो साहब के हमने दर्द व गम कितने किए जमा तो दीवान किया. Meaning simply that this is the torment, which has made him a poet. And I think this brings me, pardon me for talking about myself, I hate to do that, but I think this is relevant. I have published a book recently, which is called Torment and Creativity. I've tried to combine psychology and literature. Psychology is my subject, literature is my love. And I've talked about so many writers. You can include T.S. Eliot, you can talk about Keats, you can talk about Sylvia Plath, you can talk about Hemingway. All these people, they committed suicide. And I think they were a tormented soul. The Keats, for example, which I think, in my view, he was the greatest poet in English language. I simply love his poetry, especially the Ode to the Nightingale. The man died at the age of 25. And you know, his mother died of consumption, his brother died of consumption, and he was so badly criticized. I mean, they
Sir, I don't mean to interrupt you, but the question?
Why do we write?
The question is, this we have not talked about. I think I have to exclude the present company because that would be very critical or very sensitive. But I think what we should do is to find out what was the urge which created
My sense is that writers write for many different reasons. They said that Kafka has a really beautiful short story called The Hunger Artist, in which the hunger artist actually says that he is a hunger artist because he doesn't know how to do anything else. And I think maybe people write because they don't know how to do anything else. I know I teach because I don't know how to do anything else.
I think there's some urge.
If I could just say one thing, also, I don't know if there are really very many people who wake up one morning and decide to be a writer. I'm not sure. I know that there are some people like that, but you're asking for the specific moment when we decided to be writers. I mean, at least I didn't have that moment. It was, it was a process. It's not, there are very few people who know this in elementary school and plot their whole life accordingly. It's a confluence of life experience and, personal needs and interaction with the world and, a whole bunch of different things. But it's not one moment.
Also, the idea of torment and creativity in itself, you mentioned Sylvia Plath, etc. And there's also a similar myth about rock musicians dying at the age of 27 or something. I don't think that's statistically true of either writers or rock musicians. I think that it's a romantic idea that is seductive for I'm not sure what reason, but I think also it takes away from the sheer hard work that goes into being a writer.
Yeah.
I would just say that, I happen to be able to tell you the exact moment I decided to become a writer. But it came out of being a reader, and it came out of the books that I loved. What my brain felt like on my favorite books felt better than anything else I could imagine. And there was a certain point where my reading just hit this critical mass, and I felt like I had to start answering back. I wanted to start talking back. And it was in the middle of reading a big novel by a Mexican novelist named Carlos Fuentes, a novel called Terra Nostra, that just kind of encompasses, from Philip II or whatever, just like the whole history of Spain and El Escorial. And I just thought, you get to do that? You can just write like that. You can just, my first attempt at a novel was trying to write an homage to Terra Nostra and Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. Just started to try to answer back. I did it very poorly too. I threw that novel out as quickly as.
As the title of the program is that why do we write? So I think it's inevitable that all of us keep on returning to the same theme. So I was wondering that, mashallah, all of you are eminent writers, you are accomplished writers, you have been published, and all of you, of course, spoke about your love, your desire, and your urge to write. So I was just wondering, had you not been so successful, and had you not been published, would you still have had the love and the urge to write? Thank you.
Actually, the truth is, I don't know about the other two, but the love and the urge and the desire is what kept me going through all the years before I was published. I wasn't published till I was 31, and I've been writing since I was, a teenager. So yeah, I think success, if you're lucky. And what does success mean anyway, really? I mean, for me, success is when you read something and you get that high, when your brain gets that, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I did, my first book was published when I was 42, and I actually, when Tinkers was published, I had been trying to get it published for 5 years, and during those 5 years, I just made art for art's sake and habituated myself to, I will teach classes wherever and however I can, but I'm still gonna write, because one of the greatest pieces of advice my teachers gave me is don't confuse writing with publishing. Writing is the thing itself. Publishing, we all want to publish because making a work of art is essentially a gesture of fellowship, as it were. But the publishing is not the same thing as writing. The writing is not a means to anything else. It's the thing itself, ideally.
Along those same lines, publishing is validation, right, from the outside world, that what we've been working on for an extended period of time resonates with somebody or with a publisher or with, hopefully with an audience. But you need to be writing for some other reason, not just for that. So that's what keeps you in the story. You can't place your bets on something that might or might not happen.
And over there.
Your people's novel to all three persons. But for example, what you people, for just like Kipling and other Shakespeare poetry, for example, are blamed for how it helped the imperialism to sustain, and how about the internal colonization of the state. So you people, how, for example, in this thing you separate these novels from the political activities. For example, how your novels has, for example, are they, for example, resistant some of the dominant narratives of the state and imperialism and the corporate for example, the writing which is concerned with the corporate institutions? So my question is, are related.
Yes, I would say that my novels do actively resist the narrative of the state.
And I would say the same.
Ditto. No, point taken. I mean, I talked about this in an earlier discussion today, because when I tried to write overtly political fiction, it was terrible. It just turned into propaganda. And so one of the things that you're constantly that I'm constantly negotiating with my own books is the fact that they are implicitly against the kind of dominant narratives that are in the United States, and they just have to, in and of themselves, they just stand as contradictions. They're not explicit. They are just not what it is of which I disapprove, if that makes sense.
I have a simple question. We've heard all of you say how ideas come to you. So the minds and the brains of writers fascinate me. And I want to ask each one of you, we've talked about intuition and ideas and about how things come into your mind. And if I can ask each person, Paul, what do you feel when you write? Can you define a feeling with your writing?
Enough of the time I just feel frustration and self-pity. But when the writing is happening at the level that you're seeking, I just feel as fully engaged as a human being as I possibly can. I just feel like I'm using as much of my brain and my soul as possible, and that's what it is. I mean, I just feel like it's just every day, just sitting down and cultivating the discipline, putting in because I write fiction, aesthetic pressure on my imagination, just to try to make my brain as big as possible, I guess,
Yeah, I find that when writing works, when it's going well, it feels transformative. It feels transcendent. I mean, it's just what Paul is saying about, your brain feels really large, and all of you feels like it. I mean, for me, all of me feels like it's coming together. And but I have to say that those moments are not, I wouldn't describe those moments as being there every day by any means. A lot of it is just the hard work and the nitty-gritty of doing it. But that those particular moments are, they're so worthwhile, and you just hope for that every time you sit down.
I would agree with both of them. Transcendence, transformative, in the local lingo, current lag jata hai, but in a good way. But like she said, that's something that happens to you once in a while and that you aspire to. But from the outside, apparently, I'm an awful human being. So the moments when I feel best, because I'm writing other people who have a claim to me, you know, my children, my husband, my parents, other human beings, I'm an awful human being because I feel like I'm in communion with my purpose, and anything and anybody else is a distraction or an obstacle. That's a tough question.
I think it's too late now. I don't know. But one thing, you know, there's sort of transcendence, but there's also beautiful. It would seem like a paradox, but it's art, so it's great. But it's because it's when I experience it, it's not so much total transcendence or whatever. It's actual total immanence. I feel like I'm totally embodying my brain, and I feel, you know, scientists have said there's nothing more complicated. Nothing has been observed in the universe that is more complicated than the human brain. And so, you know, what I want to do is I want to make works of art. You all have, you know, we all share these equally complicated, amazing, gigantic minds, and I just want to make art that sort of fills your great big brains with stuff that, you know, you find worth, you know, occupying your minds with.
If I could just say one more thing to that, to Paul's description. When I find that writing is working really well, what happens for me is that the world slows down. It's in slow motion, and you see everything so clearly, and that process makes that process is pretty astonishing. So.
Hi, I'm Faisal, and I wanted to ask you that, you know, when in West or in East, the writing themes and these are a little bit different. But you know, in Pakistan, especially in the South Asia, we have conservative society, kind of that thing. And then here people, sometimes it happens that they cannot write about certain things because they fear the response that will be given to them, like maybe because of you know, something about politics, religion, or society. So sometimes a writer has to make decision that, okay, let's not go to that point and let's not go to that topic because maybe it will not be good for me in future. So I wanted to ask all three of you that have you ever come across that situation and where you had to take this decision? And after taking that decision, what did you feel? I mean, isn't it not, isn't it a little bit unfair to your mind and thoughts and creativity to refrain from going there just because you fear of future or consequences? Thank you.
Well, that's an interesting question. Actually, my first novel was very much about such a topic because I wrote about 71, and part of the process that I embarked on was to interview soldiers who had fought in 71 in East Pakistan. And that was a difficult topic because even these days, 71 isn't really very much discussed, and we haven't really made peace with it. So there is a way that as a writer, we can make a decision to talk about silence and forgetting and talk about those kinds of things that aren't accessible to us in society. And I guess we have to make those decisions each individually about what our purpose is and what we think we want to do and the stories that have a hold over us.
Can I just add, if you read Noor, you'll see that actually Sorayya has not shied away from describing in graphic detail what happened. And those passages are both incredibly moving and incredibly shocking simultaneously.
I think सबसे पहले तो ये बात है कि I would question कि हम वाकई इतने conservative हैं. मेरे ख्याल में हम इतने conservative नहीं हैं. I think कि ऊपर से conservative हैं, but actually we have a rich and diverse history of writers who have always, done what has come naturally to them. मेरे लिए जो ज़्यादा दिल पे बात लगती है वो ये बात है कि आप लिख भी लें तो आपको कोई छापेगा नहीं. मसला हमारा ये होता है. It's not that we don't write, it's that we are not published. So.
Yeah, I mean, I have, had the luxury of not having any subject sort of explicitly unavailable to me. I don't have to, But in the United States, I mean, when I in Tinkers and in both of my books, I mean, I've become very, very interested in religion and where I grew up. It's don't think about religion seriously. It's it's superstition and and of course, the more theology I read, the more I read about religion, the more welcome to the entire history of humanity. So there's stuff going on there that I don't like. But I have always been fascinated with one of the kinds of literature was fascinated with when I began to write was like the literature of Eastern Europe. Like Danilo Kish and Ismail Kadare and some of the Latin American writers who wrote, it's called magical realism, or it's fantastic, or it's parabolic, but it's because they were writing indirectly. They were making literature and art that was indirectly, but certainly, protesting whatever kind of regimes or whatever censorship that under which they lived at the time.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Up here. Yeah, with the mics. Where?
My name is Dr.
The young man at the back, and then we'll.
My question is: there are some stages like reading, like listening, and then comes the observation. You see something by your eyes, and the third stage comes when you experience something, like 71 War. What challenges as a writer you face when you write about something but you haven't experienced, and what you haven't observed? This is the second stage. And the third stage, okay, you listen something about and you just watching the TV or movie or something, wherever. So how do you handle, any one of you, each of you rather, handle this situation? Because you have to put something live in the novel.
Well, I guess there are a couple of different things. I had a teacher once who explained to me that in terms of writing, to do research for writing, the idea is to discover what the possibilities are. Not so that you write about those possibilities, but so that you can write around them, right? So I didn't know anything about 71. Nobody in my family fought in 71. I was just very interested in the silence and forgetting in Pakistani society around 71. So how to learn about it? The way to learn about it is to talk to people who were there and to go and visit the place and to learn their stories. And as a writer, what I'm interested in is where their humanity is in those stories, right? Because there's always humanity on all sides. And so I learned about that, I think, from talking to people who participated on both sides, and in terms of actually being there and visiting various places.
I would just say is that, I always feel, in theory, as writers, we are allowed to write about anything we want, and we are allowed to imagine any lives we want. But a work of art is not theoretical. It's an actual particular artifact that you make. So we're always, I've had the experience of deciding I'm going to imagine a certain set of lives or a certain set of circumstances, and I get 50 or 60 pages into it, and I just think, I can't do this. I can't imagine my way in without it being fraudulent. And so I just sort of quietly burn the manuscript and leave. But as a fiction writer, there's just a difference between being a fiction writer and writing nonfiction or doing kind of documentary work. Because my ideal is always I write fiction because it's experiential. So I'm always writing about the subjective experience of whatever the events are that in which the character finds herself or himself.
My apologies, I've just been handed a note. It says we must finish at 7:15 because there's a wedding here at 7:30. So that is the last question. Thank you very much, and thank you to the panelists.